Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Kind Health Group YouTube and podcast channel. We have a great guest with us here today, Dr. Sabrina Falquier Moncrine. Hi, Sabrina.
Hi, nice to see you.
Dr. Falquier is board certified in internal medicine and is obtaining her culinary medicine certification through Tulane University. She has a thriving outpatient primary care practice at Sharp Rees-Stealy Medical Group here in San Diego, California. And since 2016, she has incorporated culinary medicine into her practice and has started a shared medical appointment model with a culinary medicine focus within her multi-specialty medical group, including researching health outcomes. Dr. Falquier is highly involved with Olivewood Gardens and Learning Center in National City, California, which is a nonprofit organization that empowers all age groups through gardening, nutrition, and culinary literacy. She has been on their board of directors since March of 2017. She is also a contributor to the Washington Post, CBS News, Edible San Diego Magazine, has been interviewed by a number of media outlets, and she's also a very dear friend of mine and one of my heroes. Welcome, welcome, Sabrina. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be seeing you guys. Not quite as in person as I'd like, but I'll take it anytime.
And Annie is with us today as well. Hi, Annie.
Hi, welcome, Sabrina. I'm super excited to talk to you today.
Me too.
So I think let's get started with how you're doing and just how you're doing today in the scope of everything that's happening with COVID-19.
You know, I feel like I'm managing quite well. I tend to be definitely a glass half full person. So this situation, the way they have us working at Sharp Rees-Stealy is they have us working in shifts. So I'm actually working Mondays and Tuesdays. And so the rest of the week I'm home and I'm able to spend time with my kids, and they're of course homeschooling as well and have been incredibly independent, which has been really nice. And I've been able to really spend kind of that silent time or quiet time really zoning in on what feels really important. So that feels good to have that space and to be able to use it in a way that feels productive.
So Sabrina, how do we eat healthy during the pandemic?
So I love this conversation because it's been very polarizing. There's people who have more time at home, so they've been able to embrace their inner chef. And there's those that feel like, hey, life is chaotic, so I'm going to grab whatever I want to eat. And the truth is, if you keep it as simple as possible of really thinking about eating real food, so really the formula of filling up half your plate with fruits and vegetables, a quarter of your plate with whole grains, and a quarter of your plate with well thought out proteins, that's going to get you really far along as far as how to eat healthy.
I love that. So when we're talking about well thought out proteins, which I love the term, what do you mean by that? So
when we think of what we are putting in our bodies as a country, we tend to eat too much protein. And the problem with the type of protein that we have is two things. If we're eating animal flesh, so animal meat, we are eating whatever that animal ate. So if we think of beef, for example, there's a huge difference if we have grass finished or 100% grass fed beef, where essentially the type of fat that the animal accumulates is very different. It has a lot more what are omega-3s, which tend to be anti-inflammatory to the body, versus omega-6, which are pro-inflammatory. But even going to the best well thought out protein, the best thing that we can actually do for our body is move more and more towards plant-based eating. So things like beans and lentils, garbanzo beans, or things like hummus, those have incredible amounts of protein. And as a country, we eat 3 times the amount of protein that our body needs. So often we think if we're not eating animal flesh, we're not getting enough protein, but we definitely are.
So I love this part of the conversation because I know that you and I went to a seminar together where we talked about, the differences between what has protein in it. So for example, people don't think that broccoli has as much protein, but could you speak a little bit about the difference between eating broccoli as your protein versus maybe eating animal flesh as your protein?
Mm-hmm. So when we think of protein and what we need from the protein. What we actually need are the building blocks. So one of the things that's really great to see, and all three of us experience this together, is that depending on what you're eating, from broccoli to beef and anything in between, that you are actually getting all those building blocks. You're going to get them in different amounts depending on what you're eating. But if we get more variety, we're going to get all the building blocks our body needs, because when we eat protein, we're not taking that actual flesh and turning that into muscles, which is what most of us want to build. Our body actually breaks it down into the amino acids and then builds its own protein stores.
So when I was grocery shopping, I noticed that it was really hard to find beans. That was one of the first items, rice and beans, that were gone. What do you recommend people have in their pantries to kind of get through the weeks?
So it's funny because I feel like some people have a lot of either rice and beans or other grains that maybe they got excited about when they read a recipe, and it might be in the back of the cupboard. So I encourage you to look in what you already have at home. And the great thing is that if we do whole grains have a lot of protein in them as well. So if you are doing rice, the darker the rice gets, the more protein content and fiber it's going to have, minerals, healthy oils. So if we're looking at rice, if you can't get white rice, I'm actually happy that now you have to reach for maybe a darker color rice. So brown rice, red rice. One of my favorites is called forbidden rice, which is a really dark, nutty one. And same thing, things like quinoa or fado or teff. I mean, there's an endless list. So usually what's great is the grains that are actually available on the cupboards are the more, I think some people would call them exotic, or ones that people don't know as much about. But the beautiful thing is you cook them just the same. So you can cook them pasta style, where you just put more water than you need. You boil it, you salt it till it tastes like the ocean, and you boil it for usually 20 to 40 minutes, depending on what the grain is. And then you drain it out, and that you can have in your refrigerator and use it in different ways throughout the week. So it's also a way to not feel like you're starting from scratch, especially a lot of people don't like to cook, and it feels overwhelming now that there's less options available. So learning to batch cook, which we can go into if you want, of what are ways to optimize your time in the kitchen.
Yeah, so I love that. And as you know, I'm a batch cooker. I'm a batch soup cooker. It's my favorite thing to do. So talk a little bit about that, because I think the idea is intimidating to a lot of people. But I think if we can break it down and make it easier for everyone, I think that would help a lot. And, easy tips for getting started if you're not comfortable in the kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. So even going back a little bit from the batch cooking is what to buy at the grocery store to then be able to batch cook. So I think of, again, having whole grains, thinking about what your week is going to look like. So for most of us, there's a lot of home time. So we may not be comfortable in the kitchen or desire to be in the kitchen, but a lot of the cooking that we're going to talk about with the batch cooking, there's not a lot of hands-on time. It's really more the fact that we're actually around makes it easier. So things like buying vegetables that you can buy eat raw. So that could be for either snacks or days where you don't feel like turning on the stove, especially now as it's getting warmer out. So that would be things like sweet peppers, celery, carrots, whatever your household enjoys, even cruciferous vegetables like cauliflower or broccoli. And even so, when you bring those home, having them in a separate refrigerator drawer than the ones that need more attention, such as cooking in any format that you want. Also buying fruit in season. Right now, berries are starting to come out. So that is the beautiful thing, is they are less expensive during this time of year. You can also buy them frozen. Any of these produce can be bought frozen. And then the vegetables that require a little bit more love, those I'll put in a separate drawer. So I organize my drawers. The top big drawer will have fruits that we can just easily grab. The other one will have vegetables that can be eaten raw. And then the bottom one will be herbs, and then also vegetables that need a little bit more attention. And then I'll come home and essentially row several trays of vegetables. So I will think through literally open up drawers and say, what can I use? This is a great way to use things you just bought if you just went to the store, or also things that may not be as crisp as they once were, but once you roast them, it gives them a full life. So that reduces food waste as well. So things like broccoli, cauliflower, tomatoes, kale, just make sure you set a timer, especially for the kale. I've ended up with volcanic eruption or volcanic ash sometimes if you lose attention, as well as making sure that, so while those pans are roasting, you essentially make a single tray, drizzle it with olive oil, a little bit of salt. And the reason you want a single tray is you want the roasting effect. So putting it about 400 to 425 degrees roast setting. And most take about 15 to 25 minutes, except that kale. And while that's going on my stovetop, I'll be making 1 or 2 whole grains. So that'll be a whole wheat pasta. And then another grain that, again, I either had in the back of my pantry. Like yesterday, I found frikke that I bought for a class a few months ago. So I use that, as well as, again, a whole wheat pasta is a great one to do. And then a legume, so a bean. So either canned beans if I'm feeling lazy, or I'll make 1 or 2 types of beans from dry. And then I'll use those throughout the week. So that doesn't mean I'm going to eat the same thing every time, because that gets boring. But I'm going to use those roasted vegetables. The first night I might have them on, warm on the plate itself. If I made several, I'll create almost strips of the different colors and I'll just put them there. And that has been the way I've been able to get my kids to eat a lot more vegetables. Is I don't tell them you have to eat this. I'll just put them there, and maybe on their plate, I'll put the one that I know they like. And I've noticed through the years, now they really crave and pluck many more different vegetables. And then the next day for breakfast, I'll have an egg over roasted vegetables. And then for dinner that night, I'll use those same roasted vegetables and mix them with my favorite broth. So now I've created 3 completely different meals with 1 time of roasting vegetables.
Can you talk a little bit about where you're getting your vegetables? Are you just going to the grocery store? Do you buy them at farmer's market? Are you doing like a box that's delivered? What are you doing?
Well, Annie, all of those are fantastic options. The key is making sure that one is getting fruits and vegetables. So the farmers markets were closed for a while and then open and then closed, and now they're open again, and they have very specific safe measures so people can get their vegetables or their produce in a really safe way. I've actually been going to specialty produce a lot. They've always had a setup, since they cater to restaurants throughout San Diego, to really create a safe environment. So it's been, I tend to go there and start in the farmer's market, walk-in fridge. So make sure you bring a jacket if you do go there, because it is very cold. But I like knowing that by going there, I am supporting the local farmers, because they've been struck on such giant levels. And to know that when I buy either a specialty produce or I go to Little Italy farmers market as well, I know exactly where that money is going to go to, and it keeps it looping in a smaller loop, and it keeps my local economy moving forward, because I don't want those farmers to go away. And I know if I'm directly buying from them, that I'm helping them and their family directly.
I love that your kids eat all of that stuff.
It took a while, and it was interesting, because I made I actually posted my alter ego Sensations MD, and the other day I posted this tower of kale that I made, and it was definitely, I felt more than it was 2 full sheet trays of kale, and it was pretty much gone except 1 little cube that I put in for my lunch the next day. And especially, there's something about kale and roasting it, and I use
nutritional yeast?
vegan cheese, essentially.
Oh.
What is that? I'm blanking on the name.
Is it nutritional yeast?
Nutritional yeast. Yeah, some
Yeah.
people call it nooch. So I put nutritional yeast, so no salt, because nutritional yeast has a really salty flavor, and they just go down. But yes, Annie, it's been. I think your kids are a little bit younger than mine, but it's been really amazing to see how their vegetable consumption. I'll make sometimes something with like a curry or simmering sauce, and it'll have whatever vegetables, like mushrooms and tofu and a cruciferous vegetable. And I'm amazed when they go back for seconds. I'm still a little bit in awe.
You're a very good mom.
You're a great chef as well. And every time I see anything that you put on Instagram, it's beautiful. I mean, Sabrina's food photography is beyond words. So yeah, you always
You're
inspire
fluffing
me
my feathers.
every time I see it. I'm like, oh, I should cook more like Sabrina. But yeah, so the kids, I think if you wait long enough to feed your kids too, they'll eat anything. So
Yeah.
that helps too, you know.
Yeah.
What do you grow at home? What can people do sort of right now? Everyone's home. What can you plant and manage at home? I know maybe herbs, or what are you growing right now?
So I always say a starter, definitely herbs are great. Just know that mint will take over. So if you have a small pot and you put a variety and mint is one of them, you will end up with only mint in a few months. So if you're going to do mint, do it in a separate pot or separate area of your garden if you're going into the ground. So right now, actually, one of my really enjoyments of getting exercise is actually riding my bike to the local nursery, and I'll pick up one or two herbs. So I think this year I actually have more herbs than usual, but I have parsley, cilantro, dill, sage, dill, or I already said dill, mint, two types of mint, which I finally decided in an area of the garden I'm okay if it takes over. And then as far as I have a curry plant, and you rub it and it smells like curry. I experienced it at a garden that I did an event at, and I came home and I bought it right away, and basil as well. So yeah, slowly my husband's been really great at just letting me take over the garden. We used to have a lot of more visually appealing pieces in the garden, and every year I've chopped off more and more to make it more of an edible garden, but he enjoys the fruits of its labor. So he got over it pretty quickly.
So let's talk a little bit about gardening then. So how can the average person that maybe not have maybe not have a big yard or a big, space for a garden, how can they reasonably start a garden in an apartment, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so pots are great. Make sure, just be careful if you buy the red porcelain. It is porous, so just be careful what you're putting it on, because you don't want, if you have wood floors, you don't want it to affect that if it's going directly on it. But herbs are a really good start. The other thing that is really easy to do in a pot is actually potatoes. And if you have any potatoes that you have purchased and they start getting their little eyes on them, you can actually replant them. So not only does it take the guilt away that you did not use the potatoes while they were still in their best living form, you can actually give them a second life. So those are really fun, especially as an adult, I really enjoy the process too, but that has been so rewarding to see how quickly the potatoes grow, and to have kids be a part of that as well, because there's nothing like harvesting your own potatoes. And you could actually do that on a small balcony if that's what you have, or even near a window if you had indoor space only.
Cool. So what do you think, now that we're kind of in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic, how do you think this is going to affect our food supply and the way people think about food going forward?
Mm-hmm. So this is really interesting. I feel like when we think about COVID and how powerless that has really made so many of us feel in different realms, and it could be anything from what if I get it, to financial powerlessness of losing your job, or having a lot less days where you're getting paid, or having a job that is not an essential work, yet that's your source of income. So what does one do with that? And a lot of it is really coming back then to thinking about what parts do I have control over? And one of those pieces is how to optimize our immune system, because if we were to get the coronavirus, there's not an antibiotic, it's a virus. There's no medicine that can remove it. It's really our own body that has to fight it, like the common cold, or if we got the flu. So really thinking about what can I do, and really, again, focusing on real food. So trying to limit, not saying, this is also unprecedented times and stressors are going to be high. So if there's a certain junk food that you love, do it once in a while with no guilt, no shame, no I cheated, like just do it and move on from it. But then going back to really trying to focus on 80 to 90% of the time, trying to eat what we talked about. So that formula of the page, and that goes for snacks. So one of the ways, if we're feeling peckish, which with a lot of people are, so setting out a bowl of fruit that you can easily grab, either you or your household. And I don't know about your kids, but mine, if it's chopped, they'll definitely eat it. If it's just an apple, they won't grab and munch it. So I try to get in the habit of cutting up fruits and know that they're going to grab them. I'll put out some nuts. I'll put out easy things. So if people know that food really plays a role, I do feel like there is this more awareness. And part of it could be because they're worried about, if I go to the grocery store, a big chain grocery store, how many people have touched that food before it's coming to me? And if so many people have touched it, is that increase my chances of bringing home the virus into my household? So again, if one buys from our farmers or a place like specialty produce where less hands have touched it, that is going to affect the chances of us bringing it home. So that's part one. We don't want our food to be quote unquote dirty when it comes home. But the second part is knowing that if it's grown locally, if it's grown in good soil, the nutrients are going to be much greater that are coming into our body.
Well, and I love the connection that you help people, you teach people how to cook and how to eat better for their health. This is really very important right now. Talk to me a little bit about how you teach. I mean, I know you can talk about the plate and what we're supposed to do, but how do you teach people who have never even thought to eat this way before? Because you're right, it is going to help us fight, and we should be eating as healthy as we can. So what do you use as your teaching tools?
So a lot of it's interesting because I've done from cooking demonstrations to hands-on cooking classes, which is really when rubber meets the road. And when people have that awkwardness of having that knife in their hand, or really having to think about being asked, why don't you taste this and tell me, do you feel like it needs anything else? And a lot of times there can be this kind of deer in headlights of saying, I don't know. and then starting to give them the language of, okay, do you think, is it bland? It's almost like wine tasting. I feel like people have had more experience with thinking about adjectives of wine tasting than they do with food, or especially creating their own food. So teaching them, empowering them of saying, if you feel like it's bland, let's go with that. And I've gotten in the habit of actually not tasting the food at demos and having their word be the word, because then it's almost like a parent 99% doing the science project for a kid, and then it has the kid's name on it. It's like, I want somebody to take ownership of that. So a lot of times is figuring out their starting point. So this I'll do when I'm with patients in the office. I'll always take a diet history. I hate the word diet, but food intake history, if we want to change it to that. So figuring out where their starting point is, because then it gives me an idea of what they enjoy, and also how they feel about what they're eating. So if they're big pasta eaters, I'm going to have a very different conversation with somebody that goes to Mexican restaurants every day, or burgers and fries every day. So starting with figuring out what their palate already enjoys, and then moving that in the direction that increases vegetables and fruits. Because the truth is, if we simplify, and this is what I always want also people to know, that one can get wound up into all the minutia details about vitamins and minerals and, oh, I have bad eyes, so I need a certain color food. If we really step back, it actually can be really simple. And that's the part of reminding people, even when I do these multi-week classes where each one focuses on a different aspect, the questions that come up often are people who clearly are really excited and interested. So they've gone home and they've started researching and getting on the internet, and they've wound themselves up in this hole where it's like, okay, let's dig out, let's get bigger again.
I love how passionate you get when you talk about food as medicine, and I feel the same way. And it's something you and I have talked about a lot, and we've been practicing primary care for almost 20 years together. Let's talk a little bit about food as a way to reverse and impact chronic disease like high cholesterol, diabetes, blood pressure issues, and, cardiac disease in general, metabolic diseases, cancer prevention. Can you speak to, I think sometimes there's been a disconnect for a long time about how food can impact that aspect of medicine. And I think, part of what your program that you're bringing to Sharp is bringing, shedding light on that connection. So I'd love to hear you talk more about that, if you can kind of enlighten the rest of the world.
Absolutely. So there's two things, is how I was just talking about the winding up of these details at what can get in. The beauty of the educating people about using food as medicine or using food as health is that it's not that it's one way of eating if you're diabetic and a different way of eating if you have high blood pressure or if you have high cholesterol. there, you can find detail areas where maybe you need to modify certain foods, but the overall global is if someone has anything that goes under the umbrella of cardiometabolic syndrome, so anything from overweight to obesity, diabetes, hypertension, or a history of a previous heart attack, the benefits are for all of those. So that's the beauty, is the shared medical appointments. People walk into the room and they could have any of those diagnoses and the conversation is going to be the same. So that's the beauty. And to realize, actually, even this morning, I was reviewing a study looking at how does it affect one if one has one session with your primary care doctor. So 5-minute, hey, you could improve your blood pressure if you eat better, and you give them a handout, versus doing a multi-week versus essentially more intervention each time. And even that 5 minutes giving a handout makes a difference to change in behavior, which is great. So that's one of the things that I sometimes feel so stuck in primary care, where we always have this limited amount of time to realize that it does make an impact. Just like with smoking, that we're taught to always ask every patient every time, are you smoking? Are you still smoking? Have you still stayed off smoking? That to make sure that we talk about food and the role of food, because there's been such a disjoint between food and health, and yet now there's finally this transition of saying we've gotten to a point where it's hard to life expectancy started to go down. The improvements that we can get from interventions like cardiac catheterizations, other big interventions, we've hit a plateau there. So now I feel like a lot of even large medical practices are finally going back to the drawing board and saying, wait a second, if we change behavior that might actually decrease those outcomes that need those interventions, we're getting somewhere. So that's an exciting, it feels funny because in a lot of ways it's going back to very basics of what we feed our body, but it's nice to see that it's slowly getting to be more well-known, more supported as well.
And I think not just in the general public, even in the physician community, are you finding that, initially there was, I know we've talked about this a lot, there's some pushback on it. And I think that's changing, hopefully.
It is. And it's interesting that you bring that up, Georgine, because I find it fascinating as culinary medicine is such a new area, a new specialty, and one of the things that's so wonderful is that it's wide open as far as the audiences, and that goes with you saying the physicians, because as I've gone out and given talks to all realms, so you have physicians on one end to grand rounds to patients directly to in the community of different, I've done work with East African community in San Diego, to Latin community, to Filipino, and it's really interesting to see that a lot of times the most resistant is the medical community. So, but there's some change. It's slow, and once they hear, okay, that it does make a difference, because a lot of times, well, that's not my job. I'm the doctor and I'm over here. And to realize, same thing with the smoking, if you're only giving them the pamphlet for the smoking cessation, but you're not talking about it, there's a lot of studies that look at this too, that if the medical providers look at this and talk about it, and even, again, it doesn't have to be a huge discussion, but just bring it up, patients listen. They want, and they walk in if they know they have a health issue, if they've stepped on the scale and it's 30, 50 pounds higher than it was in high school, they know, and they're almost waiting for it. But often if it's a lost opportunity if the provider doesn't bring it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really I also think it's really important to what you said. You sort of take the food history and find out where they are. You're not just going to be like, okay, stop eating all of this and switch to completely tofu. And, I do think it's baby steps. And I think it's important that you take the time and you listen and you try to work with, where they are. I think that's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah. And I do feel like that's sometimes a blocking point, is it's not a one size fits all formula. If you come in and somebody walks in the door and they have a culinary history where they grew up in Mexico City like I did, and they have a certain flavor profile versus the next person who grew up in Thailand and they have a different flavor profile. If you say, okay, if you use the word healthy, well, what does that mean? You know? And so knowing where, again, that starting point or what they enjoy, so you're not stripping away their cultural history, their feel-good foods from their parents, or, you know, or their kind of, yeah, their enjoyment of food. Because as you guys very well know, I love food. And so when I do culinary medicine, it is going to taste delicious. And the fact that it happens to be incredibly good for you is secondary. But that's one thing I want to say. So it's bland, boring, boiled broccoli is not the name of the game. So anything to move away from that.
And I think that's a really important point. A lot of people associate healthy food with not tasting good. And so striking that balance and having the deliciousness be the primary focus, I think, is key. And I think that's where people struggle. Let's talk a little bit about barriers to achieving, so a lot of, income barriers, really. A lot of concern is that in underserved populations, it's really difficult for them to access good fruits, high quality fruits and vegetables and organic produce. And, going to a farmer's market, there's a higher price point. You hear about food deserts in underserved areas. And I know you've been working with Olivewood Gardens. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about how we can bring that to those communities. I think that's an important piece of it as well.
Yeah, so that is such a good point. And again, it kind of goes with the one size fits all model doesn't work. So if I'm, depending on, again, who the audience is, or if you tell someone, hey, you gotta go and eat all organic, which I don't believe is the case, and we can talk about that as well, but there's this, you lose somebody. Same thing, if somebody eats beef every day with their meal and you tell them to go 100% plant-based or vegan, you've lost them already. So that's education and empowerment. That's the huge part of it. And that's one of the things that Olivewood Gardens and Learning Center that's been really amazing is to those teaching points of learning that whole grains, you can buy them in bulk, so they can be really inexpensive. And a lot of the people in the community have actually bought giant in bulk, and then they split it within that community, and realizing the amount of protein that is in a whole grain. So there's a sense a lot of times, and again, at Olivewood, it's mainly a Latino community, and there's a sense of needing your meat with every meal. And if you think about that, if you use the money that you use for what would feed one person, a steak per person or a burger or whatever that meat looks like, and now you add a lot more vegetables and fruits. So say you make a stir fry, or say you make tacos where you make a veggie hash, and you may still have the meat, but now that one steak is feeding a family of 4 to 6. So you are utilizing, because meat products tend to be one of the highest price points as far as grocery shopping. So if you still want that meat flavor, and this has been a big way to get non-believers to start believing, is you're still using all the same spices and herbs that you use in traditional Mexican cooking. I'm using that as an example, but now I'm making a veggie hash. So chopping up a lot of vegetables, as well as chopping up that steak, and it could be leftover from the day before, or again, making a steak now. You're still getting all the flavors, but you're increasing the micronutrients. You're also utilizing your finances to give you a lot more nutrients through those vegetables and fruits. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's just changing the proportions and educating people about what that looks like on the financial end is key.
And sometimes I feel like it's education. If someone teaches you how to make a recipe that tastes similar to something that you already like, and that it's better for you, people will choose it. It's just a matter of maybe they didn't know. Do you have any websites, or, what do you use for like cooking channel, or anything that is sort of a great place for people to start? Maybe if they want to make a transfer over to maybe a more plant-forward diet right now, like if they're home and they're stuck at home and they've got a lot of time on their hands, what do you recommend?
So it's actually interesting. In San Diego, we tend to like Mexican food. And actually Olivewood Gardens and Learning Center has an incredible array of recipes, both in English and Spanish, which is fantastic. And they tend to be really what we call plant forward. That's my plant forward omnivore is what I call myself. So I eat everything, but really well thought out when I do eat animal protein. So they have a great website. The other part is it's interesting. There's this looseness that comes with comfort of cooking, of realizing one does not need to follow a recipe per se. So I tend to read recipes. I more have them at my bedside and just get ideas. And then I'll go in the kitchen with being like, oh, this person did it this way and this person did it that way. So I can try with whatever I have at home. But also just kind of start playing around. But one of the ways, if we're trying to optimize our kind of our bang for the buck, if you say, as far as from a nutritional standpoint, there's a checklist that it's called Dr. Greger's Daily Dozen. And he really does a great job he's fully plant-based. So just keep that in mind when you look at it. And he looks at, kind of gives you 12 things to really touch base on, from hydration to using spices, because those have their own nutritional properties, as well as legumes, leafy greens. So I use those as a checkbox, because you're only going to fill your plate up so many times in a day. So if we do it with food that is nutritionally dense, we're less likely to just fill it up with fillers, so to speak.
Those are great resources, and I'll have you send me those links, and we'll put them on. We'll attach them to the bio at the start of the show, so everyone can get a look at those. I want to get back to a point you made earlier about organic versus non-organic, farm raised. How do we know what on earth is real and what's not these days?
Yeah. So again, to not wind ourselves up too much, if cost is an issue, any fruit or vegetable is going to be better than no fruit or vegetable. And if we are looking at health properties, so right now, since people are sometimes not able to go to the store very often, getting frozen fruits and vegetables can be financially, as we talked about the financial part, often it's less expensive. It's also picked at peak season and flash frozen right then. So the nutrition properties are fantastic. They can be, sometimes the texture can change a little bit, because as they thaw out, sometimes they can be a little bit more waterlogged. So just keeping that in mind with however you're choosing to cook it. And then canned would be my third choice if we're doing produce, because it can be salt laden. So if you do get canned, which again is better than having no vegetables at all, making sure you rinse it a few times with water to get rid of some of that extra salt. And then as far as the organic, so there's two lists, and we can attach this also, called the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. So if one were to optimize our finances and thinking about foods to spend a little bit more money on it for organic, that would be the Dirty Dozen would be the ones to focus on.
So now that we're going through this crisis, and people are very anxious about their food supply and about going to the grocery store, what's your take on being in the grocery store during this time? And do we need to sanitize all of our grocery items? And how do you feel about this?
So it's funny, I actually was interviewed for the Washington Post a few weeks ago, because I have had many patients in primary care who have overdone it with the bleach. And so that brings up, growing up in Mexico City, we actually would clean our produce in a bleach solution. But to make it clear, its dilution is the solution. So essentially, if you are diluting for cleaning purposes in your household, not food, it's a 1 to 100 dilution. Okay, if you're gonna put your produce in a bleach solution like that, it's 1 to 1,000. Okay. So really diluting it down, because I understand we want a sense of control. So there's been a lot of over cleaning. We could go into what our president said, but we won't do that. And that came out after the article, which is pretty funny. But the part about food, so again, thinking about how many people have touched a box or otherwise, if one feels more comfortable, again, when it's packaged or when it's canned, the contents is going to be absolutely fine. So really not worry about that. And then the produce, we've talked about a little bit about thinking about, okay, how many hands have touched that? So rinsing it, even diluting in water will help. And if you feel really strongly, then doing that really, that 1 to 1,000 dilution to just rinse the produce, and then in the solution, and then in plain water.
Now, let me ask you this.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that overdoing it, I've seen a lot of that myself. And there is, creating an extra anxiety to that, creating an extra layer of anxiety there is not helpful. So I think all that, it's great advice. Thank you. I'm sorry, Annie, go ahead.
No, I know you're an amazing chef. Is there ever a night where you're like, I'm not cooking, we're ordering in, and where are you ordering in from?
Yes, there are definitely days where, and I think you hear this all the time of chefs who that's their full job, where they're in a restaurant and they never cook at home. I'm definitely not like that. I love to cook. I love to experiment with food, but some days I want nothing to do with it. So we tend to gravitate, and I say we as our household, I have a tween and a teen and a wonderful husband, and Thai food tends to be our big go-to. Sometimes we get pizza, and then we argue what kind of dough and what kind of crust. And but I've given up on ordering the pizza I like, because it's just, I like the wood-fired ovens, and it just doesn't taste good once. Right now, you have to eat it there with a nice glass of wine, and so I've given up on that, unless I make it myself, which again goes against your question of what do I do on days I don't want to touch it.
What's your favorite Thai restaurant that you order in from?
What's funny is we've gone old school. So my husband and I met here, and we actually went back to Taste of Thai in Hillcrest. We hadn't been there for a long time, and we started ordering from there. We must have seen it on a delivery service, and I actually am really enjoying it. It's like going back to our dating days. There are all these stories, even when we get it delivered and we're nothing to do with the restaurant, but we're remembering stories of when we first started dating, like almost 20 years ago. It's kind of funny.
So cool. Yeah, I love that food also creates such a strong social bond, and you form such memories attached to food. And we've talked about that as well, that, you want to make eating food a pleasurable and enjoyable and bonding experience for whomever you're eating with. And I think that's a key piece of it too, and something that we all need right now. And I think what's been interesting is for us and my family, sitting around the dinner table is what everyone now looks forward to, because we, have a lot more time to do that. So
yeah, absolutely. I love, I feel like I want to say that. So gathering and that sense of schedule that's been lost for so many of us, and gathering at the dinner table is fantastic for more than just one meal. And the days that I'm not in the clinic, that I'm home with my kids, we always make a point of gathering for lunch, and then again, talking about when we're going to meet to start preparing dinner. So notice that they're involved in the preparation too. And some days it'll be more than others, but just that sense of coming together and realizing that food doesn't just appear out of nowhere. And that's another piece, is so many generations have lost that, because there is no, this is to be stereotyped, but back in generations, it was the mom or the grandma who would carry those traditions from one generation to another. And that's been lost. And now food just kind of appears. And so then, Annie, going back to your question of before, if people have never held a knife or seen what does it look like to add salt or herbs or spices, it can be incredibly intimidating. And then what do? We watch Top Chef shows, and there's fire and excitement and things don't look well, maybe there's a fire and you don't want it in your house, but to try to normalize and experiment. And the other part that my 13-year-old son has really gone into baking brownies from scratch during the quarantine, which is a little concerning, because I'm a sucker for really good brownies and really good chocolate chip cookies. So, but we're on like tray 5, so I don't feel the need to grab it every time I walk by. But he's learned that it depends what brand of butter there is, or if there's salted versus unsalted butter. I mean, each ingredient, like the cacao powder that we have was actually one we got in Belize years ago, and it tastes different every time. So it's been really fun. And with culinary literacy, which is that idea of learning how to cook, I find with kids especially, if they love sweet, they're going to learn. There's science to baking. So I'm not going to be concerned that he's making brownies. This is not going to be forever, but he's learning that comfort in the kitchen. And the same thing, my daughter's more of a savory, and she got into making pasta from scratch, and I'm not going to complain about that. So
I'm coming to your house for dinner as soon as this is over from now on.
That sounds good. And if it's one of the nights where we're ordering, I'll just ask what you like of the.
So, what is there anything that you want to share with us that we haven't asked today? This has been just so incredibly informative and fun. What else do you think you want to get out there? What's one truth you wish everybody knew?
So first, I'm going to say, so one of the things that I realized we didn't touch base is when we're thinking about ways of control, and we've touched really about food, which is really such a huge one, but just making sure we touch base on what I think of these 5 pillars of wellness. So we think about food, we think about sleep. So giving ourselves, again, a schedule. So trying to go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time every day. Exercise, so trying to get out at least 30 minutes a day, with our face covering, going on a walk in the neighborhood, or if that makes you uncomfortable, at least open a window and dance like nobody's watching in your house. Also, something that helps you get away from that sense of watching the news or just that anxiety. For some people, it's mindfulness, like meditating. For some people, it's getting in that garden and taking out the weeds. For other people, again, it could be methodically chopping vegetables. So something where you're just in your own head, not in a head, because our head can be our worst enemy, but really being mindful and really grounding yourself. And then the last one is connecting with people. And I know we've talked about sitting around the table. I am normally not a big Zoom fan, but just being pushed by others to do Zoom dinners of this group with 3 other couples. We tend to do a monthly dinner, and we did one on Zoom the other day, and we actually had a great time. And that reminder that even though socializing may look different, so through phone calls or Zoom or FaceTime or however it looks, to not forget that we are in this together. And that sense of just remembering to laugh and let go. And it's just so important, because those parts, those 5 pieces, those we have a say on a day-to-day, when there's so much around us that we don't have a say on right now.
Well said. Thank you.
Very well said. Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Sabrina. This has been incredible.
It's so fun always with you guys, always.
Thank you so much, Sabrina.